So this is chapter 4 of Daniel is, as far as I know, the only chapter, if you will, and with chapter headings really being something that was inserted when this was translated along with the verses. They're not in the original. It's just a flow like you would expect it to be, actually reading the story. But this part of this is written by a pagan, being Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know, when you read this, whether any of this dictated it or just to prove what Daniel was writing. But it's written from his perspective and in his voice. And there's a lot of discussion about Nebuchadnezzar and this experience that he has. And so I did some research. I've been working on it now for about a week and a half on this particular story to see who thinks Nebuchadnezzar was really saved and going to heaven and who doesn't. And the answer is some do and some don't. You know, and some of them are Baptist and some do and some don't. And some of them are Reformed and some do and some don't. And so it's I guess it's up for grabs, but it's certainly open to discussion. And it's one of the things we'll take a look at as we walk through this. This section of Daniel also is written in Aramaic. The rest of Daniel, as far as I know, all the rest of it, is this true, sure. Donnie? It's written in Hebrew, is it not? It's written in High Hebrew. And this is written in Aramaic. Aramaic was like their local language. It was universal across the Babylonian Empire and a lot of other places. But in any case, this particular section is written in Aramaic, and it's from Nebuchadnezzar. And here he talks about another vision that he has. And Lennox and I don't quite agree on this one. So as I read what he had to say, and he certainly had a lot of good things to say. This is a review of what we were looking at before. 6 conflicts in the first part of the book of Daniel. Chapter 1 is a conflict between pagan self-indulgence and consecrated abstinence. And that's the whole question of diet, right? That's what we talked about, and how the Hebrews, and Daniel in particular, but his group and specifically, had purposed in their hearts not to be defiled by the king's food, lifestyle, whatever. In chapter 2, we look at pagan magic and heavenly wisdom, and that's the large statue with the head of gold and all the rest of it, and the feet of clay. The third one is between heathen idolatry and loyalty to God. And that, of course, was the story we looked at last week about the 3 Hebrew children and Johnny Cash singing the 4th man in the fire. And there is no song about trees that I could find that is pertinent to what we were talking about tonight. So there you go. And in chapter 4, we're talking about pagan pride versus divine sovereignty. The keynote of Daniel is the sovereignty of God all the way through from beginning to end. It's all about what God does, and he does what he wants to do because he's God. And that's what it means. That's what, when we say God is sovereign, that's exactly what we're talking about. In the 5th one is impious sacrilege against reverence for consecrated items, and that's the story about the handwriting on the wall. And then malicious plotting, which is Daniel in the den of lions. So that's where we are with that. So we're going to look at Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the tree. We're certainly not going to read all of this, but the story of Nebuchadnezzar and the tree here is it's another one of his visions. And my personal feeling here, and I'm not the only one who believes this or thinks this, is that the vision itself shows Nebuchadnezzar as Nebuchadnezzar saw himself. And Lennox says that God put his stamp of approval on Nebuchadnezzar because of all the things that he did, and yet he had issues, right? Well, I can understand where he's coming from. And what he's saying is that God uses man's native intelligence to accomplish the thing he wants to accomplish, if that's the way he chooses to do that. And that's, of course, what we know, that Nebuchadnezzar was brilliant in a lot of ways. He was a brilliant administrator. He was a town planner, city planner. That's certainly not a town. And he was the man, with MAN being in caps. He was the man. Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. That's sort of where we get that pride goeth before the fall comment. But that's what we're going to see here with Nebuchadnezzar. And then, of course, the application for us is very clear. Pride is a serious business. It's a serious sin. And if you were a Catholic, you would know that's one of the mortal sins. I mean, it's a big deal. And we'll look at why that's true. Nebuchadnezzar's root sin is pride. Everybody has sin in their life. All of us do. And of course, John tells us if we say we don't, we're a liar. Well, if we're a liar, we're sinning right there. So we got it, all of us. But then, of course, there's remedy. But Nebuchadnezzar sees himself as, and to be there is believing, just like he believes himself to be just like his political personification. And what I mean by that is, there is a public figure that looks one way and a private figure that looks another. And that's really true of all of us, is it not? With some folks, it's much more pronounced than it is with others. But in Nebuchadnezzar's situation, he started reading his own press. He believed all those stories about himself. And he probably, if anybody had right to, he did, because he accomplished everything he set out to do. But his problem was he didn't know where the source of that was. And so if we do that, then there's only two options. Either it's God or it's us, right? So it's a biblical worldview or it's secular humanism. And he obviously was involved in paganism, but he's also very involved in humanism, because he believes himself to be the man. And in a lot of ways, he is. But he's yet to understand where all that happens, why all that comes to him. The dream is a direct refutation of that belief that he is that political personification, that he is who he thinks he is. Sent by God, it shows Nebuchadnezzar as he sees himself and Nebuchadnezzar as God sees him. One of the most fascinating stories in Scripture to me is the story of Gideon. And I used to do a devotion for particularly kids. Kids love it because we had some folks that were Gideon's guys, and then everybody else was Assyrians, and some people were sitting down and some standing up and some going home. And kids love that kind of stuff. Adults would if they let themselves, but kids do. It's kind of like I used to play music for 4th and 5th graders a lot, 2nd graders too, but particularly 4th and 5th graders. And I'd go in and share, old time mountain music with them because it was part of their curriculum. And there were a couple of songs that I had audience participation. I've since tried that with adults. It doesn't work at all with adults. It works real well with 2nd and 3rd graders. They like it a lot.
There you go, Don.
So, bless you, brother. There's a reason why I taught juniors and seniors and was lucky to be able to teach them. But when you look at Gideon's story, it opens up and Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press. Why? What's a wine press? Well, if everybody's seen that Lucy and Ethel thing, right? Where they're walking that. Well, it's kind of like that. It's a big round, hollowed out, down in the earth kind of thing where they did that stuff. Why in the world was he threshing wheat? Because you can't thresh wheat in a place like that. You have to winnow it. And to winnow it, you got to be up on top of the ground where the wind is. But because he was afraid. And then.
Afraid of the people taking him away from him.
Absolutely. And then God says to him, hey there, brave heart. And Gideon's like, who's he talking to? And then he goes on and so the moral of that story is, You know, how we see ourselves, he saw himself as a defeated individual. He really did. And even when he went back and destroyed the pagan idols and all that, he did it at night because he was afraid to do it in the day. He saw himself at least under a tremendous amount of threat, right? He was afraid. The people in Israel will see him as a leader because they will join him in an attack against an enormous army. But God sees him for who he is. So how does God see us? You know, we see ourselves one way, others see ourselves another way, and then there's what God sees. Well, that's what this is about. What does God see here? So he calls for his posse, right? Notice he didn't ask for Daniel first, right? It's like it's kind of like that story of Ahab and Elijah, and Ahab said, "Oh no, not him again." You know, he always gives us trouble. He never tells me what I want to hear. He wanted the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and the diviners or soothsayers, it says in the New King James, to tell him what he wanted to hear. You know, he wanted to know about this dream he had, but he didn't want it to be bad news. And and I used the word posse. He turned to his posse for an explanation, and they were unsuccessful. They're not going to do that. First of all, they knew the dream wasn't good. You have to couch that within that Middle Eastern culture, right? And they knew without question this was not a good dream. They also didn't want to, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion. I think Lennox says the same thing, but in any case, they didn't want to take a chance on being wrong. They didn't want Daniel to win again, you know, so they didn't say anything. And then Daniel calls for him. You know, he comes, the scripture says, Nebuchadnezzar says, Daniel came before me, right? Whose name is Belshazzar, which means God protects him. And the God he's talking about is Marduk or Bel, B-E-L, not B-double-A-L. But it's still the chief pagan god of the Babylonians. That's what his name means. And look at the phrase that he uses. According to the name of my God, whose God? Nebuchadnezzar's God, right? So this stuff that's happened to Nebuchadnezzar previously, right? He had this huge vision and all the things that happened there. And then he made this golden idol and he threw people in the fiery furnace and the fourth man delivered them. And he was all agog about all that stuff. How much good did that do him? And the answer is none, because he still says the name of my God. That's his chief God, right? In whom is the spirit of the gods. It's little g, plural, talking about Daniel. So you can already see where Nebuchadnezzar is coming from, and we know where Daniel is, right? Daniel is a servant of the Most High God, is who Daniel is. And he knows which one's which without having to ask. And then there's Nebuchadnezzar, who's still in this pantheon of pagan gods.
Yeah, interesting. This time he told him.
Yeah. He didn't have any,
Difference.
I don't know. He didn't have any luck last time, I guess.
Well, his buddies were on strike 3 already. So,
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. So it's just, I don't know.
I just wondered about that because I thought it odd that he
Mhm.
told him.
Yeah.
But apparently he's had a lot of other dreams before. Because if you really follow the flow of what he says to these people, he says to them when they do that other one that he won't tell them what the dream is, right? That's just a statue dream. You guys always get your head together. You get your story straight. Then you come and tell me what you think I want to hear. And that's really what he said. And then he said, that's why I'm not telling you now. You tell me what he said. Well, we can't do that. That's only, and they say that's only an ability that the gods have, meaning that they don't have any communication with the gods. And yet supposedly they seem to want to represent them. but there's no communication. Well, of course, there's no communication. They're idol gods, pagans. But in any case, so
I wonder if Nebuchadnezzar, it just doesn't go back to his pride, because, the dream starts with the big tree all over the world. I wonder if he's not just so proud to tell Daniel, because Daniel is special to him. And he's not so excited to tell Daniel that, hey, your God is finally on my side. There was this big dream, and Daniel's like,
yeah, no.
I'm one of the ones that have thought that Nebuchadnezzar converted. And part of that is in knowing Daniel, you know that he would have prayed every day for his king. And certainly Daniel witnessed to him. But then this verse here, written after the fact, he still claims Marduk as my God. So
I hope you're right, because there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask him.
That's right. It's been like 20-some years too. And so, you kind of forget over time, all that emotion and all the things of that moment. Right? How long was it? Is it 20 years? It's at least 20 years.
Yeah. The time's really hard to nail down in this particular book because of the way it's written.
he
But-
served under Nebuchadnezzar for 40, 50 years.
About 50 years, yeah.
50 years.
So, I mean, obviously, there's a long period of time available for sure. And this happens, evidently happens, and that's just, putting together circumstantial evidence. But this seems to have happened toward the end of Nebuchadnezzar's career. But since it's not, that the story is not contiguous, right? And we know that the times are not, they don't follow one another, if you will. Who knows? But this whole tree symbolism business is interesting. As soon as I read this, the first thing I started thinking about, and Lennox talks about trees and aesthetic beauty and all that kind of stuff. I'm a little more straightforward than that. I'm a little more left brain than that. But there are lots of scriptural references to trees, right? Some good and some not so good. Lennox points out the story of the fig tree that Jesus cursed, right? I didn't include that, but that's another one. I mean, there are all kinds of them. Trees were, Genesis 2:17 says the trees were for food, but the one exception was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Satan used that exception to appeal to Adam and Eve's pride, and cause and effect ensued. You can't see the word cause from where you are, but that's what it says. How do we know it was her pride? What did Satan tell her? You'll be like God. So he did two things. Number one, he denied that God was looking out for their greatest good, right? Oh yeah? Is that what he said? And of course, Eve being confronted with that said, well, he said we couldn't eat of it and we couldn't even touch it. Well, no, that's not what he said. She couldn't eat of it. He said about touching it. But, and then I always love that line in there where it says, she gave to her husband and he ate. He was standing right there. That's his fault, But anyway.
He was in the wrong place.
Yeah, he was definitely in the wrong place. And he, and then he blamed her. Like human beings do, right?
What's wrong with them?
Yeah.
This is the woman you gave.
Yeah, he did. That's a-
See, that's from the beginning.
Now, we won't go there. Go ahead.
If they were in a state of innocence, Adam and Eve,
Mhm.
was it a good sense of pride then, or was it pride in the sense? I mean, we think of pride as a sin
Mhm.
within itself.
But it's not.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So was this pride? I mean, we think of pride always in
Mhm.
an evil sense of being evil. Normally,
Mhm.
where we do when it comes to sin, we associate it with sin.
Mhm.
And I guess what I'm saying is they were in a state of innocence. So what was the element of pride in that?
Depends on your theology.
Okay.
You know that. You knew where that was going, didn't you?
Well, yeah, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you are a Reformed Arminian, which is like being a little bit pregnant, which we discuss that all the time. That's not the first time Greg's heard me say that, but that's not an easy question to answer.
It's not.
It's an easy question to answer if you're a 5-point Calvinist.
I do have a legitimate question though.
It is.
And that is,
But if you're a 5-point Calvinist, it's not a problem.
okay,
It's just part of the degree of God. Now then we're not going to get into that discussion, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that go along with that.
Yeah.
But one thing we know for sure here, it was definitely a downfall on their part.
yeah.
Because
See, I think they had free will prior to that, and I think they lost that once they had fallen.
well, I agree with that. I mean, I do too. I think the same thing. That gets pretty deep theologically
Yeah, it
when you
does.
get into that.
Well, I'm going to sidetrack.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the Genesis tree. We know there were lots of trees in the garden and they were good for food, right? And God said, don't mess with this one. And we know that when he put them out, he said, let's get them out of here before they eat of the tree of life and live forever. Can you imagine what it would have been like to have lived forever in a sin-cursed body? You see, that's and when we did that Bible study, the Bible Institute thing, that's one of the things that I remember distinctly.
Yeah.
This was God's act of grace to Adam when he cast him out of the garden, that he would die. And we don't think that way at all. But just ponder that for a minute. What if he'd lived forever in a sin-cursed body? Yeah.
I'm the youngest one in here and I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, me neither. In Daniel 4:11-17, the tree is symbolic of Nebuchadnezzar's view of himself. It's symbolic of Nebuchadnezzar. And we'll see that very shortly. I mean, that's what the story says.
I got a cultural Bible, Cheryl got me a couple of years ago. And then it says that it was common in several different cultures for trees to represent the royalty, the power. And so it was a dream that was really the soothsayers and stuff should have been able to come up with something.
Well, I think they could. They just were afraid to. And if I'd have been in their shoes, I believe I'd have said, I believe I'm out to lunch on this deal, partner. But you know, when Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, right? It was full of trees. And he built it specifically for his wife, who was homesick. And she lived in a place where there was a lot of trees. There were no trees in Iraq,
Mountains.
you know.
He built a mountain to it.
He did, yeah.
With a waterfall.
Yes, he did. But anyway.
Love, ain't it, or something. I don't know if they had slaves carrying buckets up the mountain all day long, or whether they devised a pump system.
Oh, look,
For you folks online, we got a sidebar going on here, talking about a variety of things. Come back, everybody, come back into the fold. Yeah. In Mark 15:21-22, we see the tree of atonement. And that's a little bit of a stretch, but that's the story of the crucifixion. That's the cross. And of course, we know what atonement is. That's, you know, we talked about that when we did that class in theology. Jesus' death on the cross provides atonement for believers. And then finally, the other one that came to mind to me, and like I say, there's lots of others, but just sort of pacing through this, is the tree of life, which we find in the new heaven and the new earth, right? It's in Revelation 22:2. And he says it has 12 distinct kinds of fruits on it. One comes out each month, so there are 12 months in that year, and they're for the healing of the nations. And that's God's ultimate reward. So there's some symbolic trees. We're about to see Nebuchadnezzar's symbolic tree, the dream tree. And if we look at the characteristics of this thing, it's really the characteristics of Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. The dream, God said the tree was large and strong. You hear somebody say something about Nebuchadnezzar, one of the comments is always, that he's a big man. So apparently he wasn't just politically large, he was a physically large man as well. Doesn't matter whether he was or not, it's just kind of a sideline. But the tree was large and strong. And it reached to the sky. As soon as I read that, I thought about, what's this city founded on? What's the original name of this city? Babel. And so it's founded on the Tower of Babel, which they built saying, let's build it to heaven. And God put a stop to that. But it reached to the sky. It was visible to the whole earth. Now, we know that tree, that dream, that's a metaphor, right? But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't visible to the whole earth. He was visible to everyone who lived within the realm of his kingdom. Obviously, there are other folks out there who are not being counted here, but that's what that means.
I would think that the fame of the wonder of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar could have reached easily India, because it's not that far away, in
Mhm.
China. And that may come up in a couple of chapters too.
Mhm. Yeah, there was no question that it was the premier city on earth in its time. And if you remember when Saddam Hussein took over, one of the things he wanted to do was rebuild Babylon, and actually started to do that, which that's a whole nother ball of wax. It had beautiful foliage, so it was pleasing to the eye. And we tend to think of somebody like Nebuchadnezzar as being the ultimate evil, but that's not the picture that you get here. That it had abundant fruit. Its fruit was abundant. What does that mean? That means that, and you really need to go with the next one, there was food for all. That trees can have fruit and the fruit not be any good, right? And I can think about 2 or 3 that I've eaten fruit from and won't ever do it again. I don't like it. But this fruit's not only abundant, it's used as food for all. So Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon are providing food at a price, of course, but for basically the world around them.
I think his engineers had developed irrigation system.
Mhm.
And you look at Babylon now, you don't imagine that it was lush
Yeah,
grain fields and all that, but they made their earth produce.
they did. Streams in the desert, right?
Mhm.
But so it's talking about it's very impressive, right? It's pleasing aesthetically. It's valuable physically, food and shelter. Beasts found shade under it. It says birds dwelt in its branches, and so that pretty much covers, the earth as we know it. That just only leaves the sea. But anyway, and all living creatures fed from it. That's a potent statement. So that's what this vision looks like. That's what this tree looks like. Now, if Nebuchadnezzar sees this as himself, and as himself, he would be seeing it as his kingdom, right? Because he is Babylon, and Babylon is him in his mind. And that's what I meant when I said he was his political personification. He is Babylon. All this is all good, right? So there's nothing wrong with what was going on here. The problem was the reason for which it was done. And we're about to see that, of course. And then there's the demise of the dream tree. What happened to it? Well, we know what happened to it. I love that phrase, the angelic watcher, right? Has anybody got a New King James or a King James?
I got the old school thing.
What does it say right there when it's talking about that individual? Watcher and a holy one. You don't hear that phrase watcher very often, do you?
Star Trek.
I'm sorry?
Star Trek.
Yeah. Yes, Star Trek. But that's an odd phrase in my mind. I mean, it jumped off the page at me. But he made a decree, and his decree was, and I thought, I had to think about this a while. Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Okay. Why would you cut off its branches if you already chopped down the tree? Unless you're going to cut it up for firewood, or sawmill it or something. Why would you do that? What's the symbolism of the tree? Who's the tree? Nebuchadnezzar is. What's his branches? Could be his offspring, could be his wider family, could be his political association. But it's a far reach, whatever it is, it comes off the main tree without going too far down that trail. That's why I put that word symbolism. Is it symbolism? Well, yeah, it is. And let the beast flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. So that says that stable tree, that stable government that the people had known is about to descend into chaos. And the beast flee from under it, and the birds fly out of its branches because they don't want to be a part of that chaotic situation that's about to happen. And historically, if you read through things that happened to people like Nebuchadnezzar, it's obviously a God thing that he ever came back to power, because they didn't do that. Not in the Middle Eastern culture. Once you lost power, you were done. You didn't get a do-over.
And your family.
And your family and everybody associated with it. Yeah, absolutely. So in any case, leave the stump and the roots in the ground. We know what that means, obviously. That means it's not hopeless for him, right? So the tree and the branches may be gone, but the stump and the roots still are there. Meaning there's still life, and it's widespread. Roots go everywhere. If you've ever had this, some of you I'm sure have, but I took a backhoe and dug up a stump the other day from a Norwegian spruce. The Norwegian spruce trees have roots that run like from here to Johnson City. It's crazy. And all I wanted to do was get a tree up, and I wound up tearing up about half that side of the yard, trying to get that mess out of there. And then every time I dig up another one, I'd say, why didn't you just get a stump grinder, you dummy? But anyway, so they're left there. I found it interesting that he said, put a band of bronze and iron around it. Why? Because he really doesn't tell us why he did that. Why bronze and iron bands?
Symbolism, statue.
Could very well. I mean, that's what I thought of. But
It's the silver in between.
yeah, but the only thing that I can really come, I don't know.
The detail department. Freedom Ford is hired in the detail department.
I don't know who that is talking, but
But they just send us a picture.
Can you mute them?
by May. Anyway, I shouldn't have said that. I really don't know why he told him. What? Obviously, it's symbolical. I just don't know what the symbol is.
Well, I read in the culture things that the stump was not unusual, but to bind it was, and I don't remember an explanation or not.
Maybe we protect it to keep it
Well,
together, knowing that he's
yeah.
coming back.
That's kind of what I thought, because after 7 years, the stump wouldn't, well, that depends on what kind of stunt it was. You know, if it was
If you leave a tree, just even if you leave a tree stump sitting with all of its roots, it will regrow back through itself a new tree. I
eventually.
wonder if this was not maybe instead of to capture it, because bonds are always of iron. And I wonder if this was not to capture him in prison, but maybe to hold that stump in place for his new rising,
Yeah.
his new smaller rise.
Maybe. I just don't know, but it's interesting to think about, isn't it? And then, what's Nebuchadnezzar's judgment of the whole thing? What happens to him? Well, he's let him be drenched with dew. So all of a sudden we make that transition, which we already knew, from the tree to him personally. And it says, take his human mind away and put a beast mind in, and let him share with the beast. That's supposed to be grass, and it says frass. So I guess F is good as G.
Aiming for sassafras abbreviated.
Yeah, whatever. Let his mind be changed to a beast, and there are mental conditions where that actually happens. And then let 7 periods pass. Well, 7 periods apparently are 7 years. That, or at least that's what it would seem to be.
At least 7 periods of time, whether
Yeah.
7 seasons, 7 years,
Mm,
7 something.
but it's a long time. It's not anything short. And it was so that the living may know, not just Nebuchadnezzar. This message was for everybody that saw him, knew him, were ever around him. The living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whom he wishes and sets over it the lowliest of men. Now, that must have stuck in his craw. It bound to, of course, if he was sane enough to even hear it, and which he was, because Daniel's going to tell him what all this means shortly. And what's Daniel's explanation? It's you. And you can see here that Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar had a special relationship, because Daniel really didn't want this to be about Nebuchadnezzar, and he tells him that. He said, I wish this were about your enemies, but it's not. It's about you. And for Daniel to say that to an autocratic ruler could very well have cost him his life. But Nebuchadnezzar said, I don't worry about it. Just tell me what it says. Well, we've already seen how he reacts when things don't go his way.
You see, Daniel had a real love
Mhm.
and respect for his king.
He did. And there's a whole, there's a lot of sermons in that, isn't there? Just in that one concept. But he talks to Nebuchadnezzar and he said, listen, there may be hope yet. Which, of course, and he tells him what's going to happen, right? He's going to be driven out. He's driven out of his kingdom. He loses his mind. He eats grass and with the beasts of the field and for 7 periods of time, and your kingdom will be restored to you, which was just cataclysmic. That didn't happen. That didn't happen anywhere. And so even though it's bad, it could be worse, right? But he says it'll be restored to you after you recognize the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. He had obviously not recognized that at this point. And so Daniel tells him, repent, do away with the sin you're living in. And he names a couple of things specifically. But he said, maybe God will change his mind. Basically is what he's saying. And of course, we know that Nebuchadnezzar just kind of shrugged it off, apparently. Because does this happen to Nebuchadnezzar immediately after Daniel no, it takes a year, right? So he's going along, and I thought about that. I couldn't come up with it, but that verse of scripture that says, all we've ever heard about is the second coming, and we've been hearing about it. Our fathers heard about it. And where is he? You know that verse of scripture I'm talking
Second
about?
Peter.
Is it in Peter? 2 Peter?
Yeah, I think so.
Sounds kind of Peterish. Sounds like something he'd say. But that's what I thought of when I was reading this, because it took 12 months for it to happen. God's judgment doesn't fit on our timetable, but it's sure. And so that's a whole nother lesson. That's another sermon.
You would think that he would believe what Daniel told him based on what Daniel would have done in the past, but obviously he didn't. I'm saying 11 months out, he's like,
Yeah.
must have been something I ate.
Yeah. Well, and I thought about that, but it may be that, just think about this for a minute. So put yourself in Nebuchadnezzar's shoes. He's already heard these interpretations of his vision. He's seen things happen, right? He's very, and I don't take this the wrong way, but he's very God oriented. I mean, it happens that he has maybe 35 gods, but he is very focused on the quote unquote supernatural, the spiritual. But the longer he goes away from this, just like we do, the longer he goes away from this pronouncement, the more comfortable he becomes, until he apparently believes, must have been that pepperoni pizza. And then
Nebuchadnezzar, that was his second nature.
So I'm sorry, say again?
Pride for Nebuchadnezzar is just second nature.
Mm-hmm.
He, I mean, literally, when you read it, he walked up to the top and he looked over. And then all of a sudden, he's right back to prideful self,
Mhm.
which is just all he basically is known in flesh is, look at my kingdom,
Which is
where we're headed.
exactly what that says right there. It starts off by saying, Nebuchadnezzar says, I was at peace. I was lounging in my house when I had this dream. It upset my sleep. All right, so that's how it started. Then we get over here, and this is just, you can read 29 through 32 yourself. But 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and he reflected and said, is not this Babylon, which I have built as a royal residence by the might of my power for the glory of my majesty? Who's the center? Yeah, who's the center of his world right there? And the answer is, he is, right? And he thoroughly believes that he's responsible for all this. Now, we all know differently, but
When I read that, I think of, God's account, when he makes his promise to Israel. I will bless you. I will make the field. I will do this. I will. Well, God has a right to say, I will.
Mhm.
Nebuchadnezzar is just man, and he doesn't have the right to say, I will.
correct.
I have.
That's exactly right. And so this is Daniel 29 through 32, 32. And immediately, the word was still in his mouth. He hadn't even finished talking. The word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled immediately. And pride is his root sin. Why? Yeah, there's such thing as good pride, right? You can say, I'm proud of my kids, or I'm proud of my family, or I'm proud of my heritage, or I'm, whatever it is. That's not a negative thing. That simply means I'm thankful and happy that I've seen this happen, and it's, and within our biblical worldview, we would say these are blessings of God. And I say that I'm proud of my family. I'm proud of my grandchildren. I'm
proud of your work. You're not going to do quality work.
Exactly. That's exactly true. And one of my pet peeves, by the way. But that's, I agree 110%, if that's possible. But this evil pride, what does it mean? It means that it puts man in the place of God. That's what it does. And that's why God hates it. God said, he tells the Israelites, you can't have any more gods before me. Well, when we read that, the first thing you think of is idols here and golden calves and whatever else it is, but that's really not where the problem lies. The problem lies in a rebellious spirit of mankind. And this is insidious. And unfortunately, because we all live in a sin-cursed world, we're all cursed with it. And we have to fight against it all the time. I don't want to be in charge of my life. But, I can't begin to tell you the number of times I've prayed, God, show me your will. And today I think your will for me ought to be, and you start just lining it out, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Or you pray, God, I want your will to be done, and it should be this, And that, of course, is spiritual immaturity. But pride in itself is much more serious, much more insidious, much more corrupting.
Think about it. Are we any different? Roaring 20s, just crazy. And what was it, October 29, 29, whatever, just came crashing down. And 10 years later, we're in a world war. 9/11, for 2 months, the United States turned to God. Even Hillary Clinton shut her mouth for 2 months, and then it's just right back to normal. We aren't any different.
We're not. And it's because we live in a sin-cursed world. One of the stories along that same line that I always remember, I had the great pleasure of visiting Billy Sunday's home. He lived in Winona Lake, Indiana, I guess that is. That's where we went there for a teachers convention one time. And Billy Sunday was a famous evangelist from the 1920s, and he preached lots of different places. He went to the city of Nashville, and Nashville has a street that's full of bars. From one, it's still there. It's there today. And after he preached, the saloon keepers all got saved and the bar shut down for a little while. But then somebody else bought them and they went right back in business, which is how Satan operates. This idea, of course, we know it's not new, but I put in here a phrase from a fellow named Protagoras. Protagoras was a Greek philosopher about 100 years after Daniel wrote this. And his phrase is homo mensura, which means man is the measure of all things. And that, my friends, is the hallmark of secular humanism. That what I believe, how many times have you heard people say things like, what's sin for you may not necessarily be sin for me? Well, the problem with that is it's wrong. It's unscriptural. What's sin is anything that's against God. And if I'm against God, it doesn't make any difference who I am or what I live for or where I come from. It's sin. You don't hear much about that anymore. We do here, but very few other places do people really talk about, the sanctity of the scripture and the reality thereof. And as this idea took hold, and this is not new. It wasn't new with him. I mean, it's been around from the very beginning. Then you run into a fellow named Rene Descartes.
Descartes.
Yes, Descartes. Leave the ES off. It's French. That's just me.
No accent aigu.
Pardon me?
Sans aigu.
Yeah, that's not no S. But he says, je pense donc je suis. I think thus I am. Cogito ergo sum. I think this I am. Now, Descartes was a Christian. So how does this play out? I think thus I am. No, I'm not. I am and I think. you know, because I'm created in the image of God. But this is, you know, this was a hallmark of the 18th century.
The passage where it says they measure themselves by themselves.
Mhm. Thinking themselves to be wise, they become fools. Yep. And I always think about that. I think it's out of Proverbs, but it's in the Old Testament. It says they draw iniquity with cords of vanity and sin, as it were, with a cart rope. And it's the same kind of thing. But a biblical worldview recognizes that God is the measure of all things. It's what he says that matters, not what I say, not what I think, not what I surmise. Now, that doesn't mean that God has called us not to use our intellects, not to use our mind, right? Because Jesus said you should love the Lord your God with all your
Heart, soul, mind, strength.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously God gifted a lot of people with a lot of intelligence, some folks who truly understand the biblical worldview realize and recognize what that means. And they're very quick to, like John Lennox, to put together thoughtful discussions of scripture and all the rest of that. And they can do it at a variety of levels. The great theologians of the past, if you read their writings, there are some of them that, you know, I don't know if you operate this way, but I'll read a phrase from the really good theologians and think about it for about 3 weeks and ponder it, you know, because it's profound. God has gifted folks that way, but pride is tough stuff. And then we'll end with Proverbs 29:23. Once pride will bring him low, but he who is of lowly spirit will obtain honor. And we as American Christians, and me as a type A personality, have a hard time with that concept of meek and mild. We just do, don't we? But humility is not, it's power under control. I have a good friend who played in the NFL for a lot of years. And he was doing a devotion with the kids, and he showed a clip of, he was playing with the Panthers, of the Panthers Super Bowl run. And it was in the Super Bowl game when they got beat. And I heard John Casey speak about that too, because John Casey had spent his whole life working to get there and then blew it. And he talked about how gracious God is, you know. But in any case, Kevin Donnelly is his name. Kevin played offensive guard. He was around different places, but he got 3 personal foul penalties back to back. And he was talking to the kids about what humility really means, what it means to be humble. And he said, what you see right here is not humble. And he said, it is not power under control. It's an idiot out of control. And he said, what you don't know is on the field, when they made this last call, the referee looked over and said, that's just so stupid, you know. And of course, they backed him up about 40 yards by the time he got done with what he was doing. But Kevin's a dynamic Christian, like a lot of those guys are. But God calls us to be harmless, right? Wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And I heard somebody say one time, we got the second half of that down pat. We need to work on the first half of it. Well, that's what, you know, do no damage. And then you think about the number of times that, or I do, about the number of times that I, you know, basically had my mouth in gear, my mind in neutral, and, you know, said things I shouldn't have said that affected people. And you never know. God did this to Nebuchadnezzar so that all the people around him could know what happened. This wasn't just about Nebuchadnezzar. As a matter of fact, it wasn't really about him much at all, even though it's God's third attempt to reach him. Now, by attempt, I mean God's third action, right? There are 3 times that he's come to Nebuchadnezzar, and each time Nebuchadnezzar has retained his paganism. And I hope, Donnie, I hope you're right, because I sure would like to ask him some questions on the other side. But in any case, and that's, that's the application for us. Be always on guard, always looking for that insidious, prideful, arrogant spirit. And I have struggled with it personally and continue to do so. And I hope one of these days, I feel like Apostle Paul sometimes. I don't do the things I want to do. I do the things I don't want to do. Who will deliver me from this body of death? And then he says, Jesus will.